freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to So to Speak. We spent a lot of time on this show talking about recent free speech controversies. But today, we're hopping into our DeLorean, and we're going to travel over 200 years into the past to the generation that founded the United States and began the process of making freedom of speech a Central American value. The Doc Brown to our Marty McFly on this journey is Associate Professor of Journalism at New York University, one Mr. Stephen Solomon. Professor Solomon is the author of a book published earlier this year by St. Martin's Press called Revolutionary Dissent: How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech. Revolutionary Dissent is the story of America's founding, told through the lens of how the freedom to dissent shaped that founding and continues to shape how Americans discuss and debate some of our most pressing issues. I finished reading Revolutionary Dissent a few weeks ago and knew immediately that I would need to have Professor Solomon on the show. He politely agreed, and we met in late October to chat about his book and about the men and women who gave meaning to what is, of course, the main topic of this show, the freedom of speech. So here's our conversation. Professor Stephen Solomon, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
We are discussing your book, Revolutionary Dissent: How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech. We are here at your employer's building, NYU's Journalism Institute. You might be able to hear that we're in the hustle bustle of New York, right on Cooper Square. Let's dive into your book a little bit. What prompted you to start writing this?
I teach several courses on First Amendment freedom of expression. And in doing so, it's really a history and law course. And so we start in the founding period and discuss the suppression of speech, the early laws that enabled the authorities to punish people who spoke out against the government. These were called seditious libel laws, and people were punished under it. And during this period, there's a very rich history that we get into. And so it's not a very well-known history in terms of, certainly a lot of books have been written about that era, but not necessarily from the standpoint of colonial protest and the enlargement of the public sphere of political participation, the spread of protest, and what that meant both to the law and to the accumulating resistance to the British.
Yeah, and you present this in a very unique way through stories. That's one of the things we love to do at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, is talk about how the law and how our rights interact with real people. And so you tell 9 different stories about 9 different people during the founding generation, some of whom might be recognizable to our listeners, such as James Madison, Patrick Henry, Paul Revere. But you also tell stories of people who aren't so well known, people like Andrew Hamilton, for example, or Benjamin Eds and John Gillen. I hope I'm pronouncing Benjamin's name correctly. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to structure that book that way, and then maybe tell us about a few of these lesser-known members of the founding generation?
Each of these characters, both well-known and not so well-known, are there because they're protagonists in telling a specific story about the enlarging protest movement. And so really each one of these people engaged in a different form of protest, which is so important because what we're really talking about here is that the protest movement wasn't simply pamphlets and essays. That's what survives today. You can go to the library and read essays from that period, the pamphleteers like James Otis Jr. and John Dickinson. But those were stories that, publications that were, really for the educated classes. There were a lot of patriots, people like Ebenezer McIntosh, a shoemaker in Boston, Andrew Hamilton, a lawyer who argued the case for John Peter Zenger in 1735.
Here in New York.
Here in New York.
Yeah.
And others who were involved in different forms of protest. Paul Revere, who with his engraving of the Boston Massacre.
Yeah. And one of the main theses of your book is that all these different individuals exercised free speech in practice while they might not have had it in law. What brought you to that conclusion? Because it's not a very intuitive conclusion, because you talk in your book about how there's a debate about this in the middle of the 20th century amongst professors and historians about what did the founders actually think about freedom of speech and how did they practice it?
The conventional way of going about this is to look at what the founding generation actually wrote at the time and what actually existed as the prevailing law. So the prevailing law was seditious libel, coming from the common law of England, brought ashore in the colonies because this was, these were English settlements. And if you look at the law remained throughout this period. It was, people could be punished for criticizing royal officials, criticizing the king, and they were very early on.
Yeah.
Up until 1700, there were about 1,200 cases where people were dragged into courts and punished for speaking out. But the law itself didn't change until much later. But the actual practice of the founding generation did change. Their protests by every means possible, whether it was pamphlets or essays, which were, meant so much to the more educated classes, or whether it was the more popular protest, the liberty trees and the effigies, the songs they wrote, the verse, the engravings, even plays, on and on. These popular forms of protest were things that the founding generation used to voice their dissent. And if you want to, if you ask the question, what did the founding generation mean by freedom of speech, freedom of expression, you have to take account of what they actually did. The law took a long time to change, but they rejected the law. There were attempts to prosecute people for seditious libel.
John Peter Zenger, you talk about the jury just refused to convict him.
Right. I mean, they had this law. They couldn't repeal it. It was English common law, but they could ignore it. And so they did ignore it. They ignored it in the streets. They ignored it in their writings. And they ignored it when they were called upon by the authorities to indict their neighbors. So there's really two stories. One is the law that existed on the books. That's one understanding. That didn't change for a long time. But the other understanding of what the law is the understanding that the people actually had of what their liberties were. And if you look at the kind of question of what's original meaning, the original meaning of the founding generation attached to the liberty of thought, I think you can glean from what they actually did, what they participated in, because they had no influence over the law, changing the law. They could, but they did ignore the law, and they did reject the law when they were called upon to indict their neighbors.
Yeah, it's sort of an inverse of the idea. I think Learned Hand talked about this when liberty dies in practice or in the hearts of men. You can't expect it to live on in the law. It's in this case, it's there was no liberty in law, but there was liberty in practice. Right,
and they expected to be protected when they went out and did what they did around the Liberty Tree and in the streets and when they were singing their songs of protest. They expected to be protected, and I think that's what they meant by the freedom of expression. And they formed the American political culture that we know today.
One of the main focuses of your book is, of course, the freedom of the press, which was very much important in spreading the news about the Revolutionary War, the Constitutional Convention, and whatnot. And you say in the book that to the extent that the founding generation discussed the right to dissent, the right to speak out, they focused largely on freedom of the press, and they said little by comparison about the separate freedom of speech. Why was that?
I think it was because the ideas were really spread by the press. I mean, that was the means of mass communication. People could speak, they could debate, but only the people who were there could hear it. And so the means of, you couldn't record it. the only means of spreading it was through newspapers and pamphlets and broadsides. So when it came time for the royal authorities to try to clamp down, it was the printing presses that they went after. It was the Boston Gazette, for example, that they tried to punish. So over the years, with these attempts to suppress speech, the emphasis by the founding generation became one of taking care of the press, because that was the means of really spreading dissent that they knew and used.
Mm-hmm. And well, the common law approach recognized a freedom of the press, but even then, it only had a prohibition on prior restraints. Isn't that correct?
That's right. So the crime of seditious libel was actually born in the 13th century. And then you go forward a couple of centuries in the 1500s with the invention of the printing press. That represented a new threat to the king and to Parliament. So people were now able to not just speak against the king, but also to publish and to make as many copies as they wanted. And so they did, any kind of protest, political protest or religious protest, the printing of Bibles that got the Protestant Reformation really going. That was all, the printing press. So the king had to figure out a way to control the printing press beyond seditious libel. And so the licensing of presses. And,
which John Milton addressed in Ariapagita.
Yeah, and not only licensing, but royal censors who would read manuscript. And so there was pre-publication licensing and censorship, and post-publication seditious libel. So in the late 1600s, about 1695, the licensing system expired. And it expired in the colonies as well, shortly thereafter. And so what was left was the freedom to publish, but the responsibility for what they called licentious publications afterwards. And that was seditious libel. So freedom of the press meant the freedom to publish without prior censorship, but responsibility afterwards if you criticized the authorities.
One big thing that I took away from your book is you talk about a bit the history and background of the news industry. And you talk about how the first newspaper publishing on a daily basis wasn't published until 1702. The newspaper, this news industry was new to the founding generation. Do you believe that the revolution could have happened without the advent of this daily publishing that came into being in the 18th century?
It would have been very difficult because you wouldn't have had the widespread pamphlets and newspapers that actually carried the intellectual arguments against the British taxes and the other acts that the Parliament passed. Arguments that went back to English constitutional history, Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. And so these arguments were very deep and very powerful. And they resonated with, at least with the learned classes in the colonies. So that provided the intellectual backdrop and intellectual power behind this protest movement. But it had to be more than just pamphlets and more than essays, because first of all, a large proportion of the population couldn't read and write, and even many of those who could were not learned enough to be able to read and absorb the kind of arguments that were being made. And so at a very critical juncture in 1765 in Boston, the leading patriots realized that that the pamphlets by James Otis weren't going to carry the day. They needed to expand protest and enlist the entire population in order to convince Parliament to rescind the Stamp Act. And so that's when they expanded the protest movement by virtue of demonstrations in the street, which really got started with the Liberty Tree.
And Liberty Poles. We're here in New York. There was a Liberty Pole
in New York. These were, spectacular events. I mean, they drew thousands of people. In Boston, 3,000 or 4,000 people would come to these rallies at the Liberty Tree in a town of 16,000.
Yeah.
So, this was these were very big events. And it also, the Liberty Trees, why did people come to the Liberty Trees? They didn't really come to hear politicians give speeches. They were drawn to Liberty Trees by the spectacle of effigies hanging. And so the favorite thing that the protesters would do is, make an effigy out of the British Prime Minister and the stamp collector, and hang those from the Liberty Tree, and also an effigy of the devil. Now, we think of the devil in one way today in 2016, and people smile about it. But back in Boston in the 1760s, the devil really had shocking meaning. The devil was the representation of evil in Puritan theology. So this image of the devil hanging from a tree with the prime minister was shocking to 18th century eyes and ears. So that it was a spectacle. It drew people to the Liberty Tree, and once they were at the Liberty Tree, they would talk with one another, and as songs developed, Liberty songs, they would sing the Liberty songs.
Yeah, Joel Barlow, I think, is one person that you reference, who said that one good song is worth a dozen addresses or proclamations.
Right. There's a clarity to the songs and the symbolic speech. The arguments made in the pamphlets were, as I said, very complex. But the symbolic speech, the effigies, the songs, everybody could participate in that, and there was there was a clarity to that. You didn't have to know all the legal arguments to understand that what was represented by the Liberty Tree and by the effigies was the idea that there was a faraway parliament that was acting in a way that was injurious to the colonies, and the colonies had no say over the matter, and people understood that.
Do you think that one of the reason then for the focus amongst the founders on the press was because it was really a medium that spoke to them? They were a member of the intellectual elite, the political class. You're talking about people like James Madison, who you call the framer, John Dickinson, who you call the farmer, people like Thomas Jefferson. You look at some of the state constitutions that were adopted during the Revolutionary War, and you write in your book that 9 of the 11 states had clauses protecting freedom of the press, and only Pennsylvania had a clause protecting freedom of speech. Do you think it's because that's where those people went to have these debates?
Yes, I think that's one of the primary reasons. But I also think that it took a long time for the legal doctrine to catch up with the practice of political expression. And so, yes, you had the pamphlets, you had the newspapers, things coming off the press, but you also had political expression that went well beyond that. As I mentioned, the symbolic speech. And they did these things, but they didn't necessarily theorize about the idea that these things should be explicitly protected. It's something that they did. They used it in their everyday protest, and it was the means for expanding protest. It was very meaningful and very powerful.
You write in your book that during the time before independence, John Adams said that he was not aware of the importance of these compositions, these pamphlets. They all appeared to him, as he wrote, in the circumstance of the country like children's play at the marbles or pushpins. And then he went on to add in a letter to Jefferson, this is of course after their presidencies when they became good friends, that he said that he was in great error of having that opinion. No doubt for these things were necessary to give popularity to our cause both at home and abroad. So and at least in his case, he didn't see them for what they were until much later. And he had the Alien and Sedition Act, which you also talk about extensively in your book.
Well, John Adams was one of the early patriots to come to the conclusion that they needed to break from England. Mm-hmm. I mean, he saw that probably a year or two before most others did. Mm-hmm. And so he felt that once he concluded that it was time to strike out on their own, he didn't have the patience for the continual writings and all the different forms of protest. He just wanted to get on with it, and so that's why he expressed that. And then later, looking back and saying, well, we needed that extra year or two because in order to have a revolution, we needed the public to buy in, everyone, and the colonies were not yet at that point, and so the extra year or so did convince a lot of people throughout the colonies that this was the time to do it.
You spoke earlier about symbolic speech. What was the importance of the number 45 to the founding generation?
Oh, 45. Yeah. Well, 45 became a symbolic number, and that goes back to England and John Wilkes. So John Wilkes was a member of Parliament, and he also happened to publish a newspaper. And in the 45th issue of his paper, he made the mistake, I guess, of criticizing the king, and was then prosecuted for seditious libel. And so the number 45 became kind of symbolic of political martyrdom, symbolic of freedom of speech. Mm-hmm. And it was used all over England to symbolize that. And then it spread to the colonies, and it became widespread as a symbol of protest with Alexander McDougall in New York when he was jailed.
We have a McDougall Street here in New York.
Yeah, we have a McDougall Street right in the village.
Yep.
And he went to jail after criticizing the New York Assembly for a deal that they did to provide supplies to the British troops who were then in New York. He protested against that by distributing a broadside around the city. He signed it a Son of Liberty. Of course, he wasn't going to use his own name because he didn't want to be prosecuted. Yeah. But they did find out his name because the royal governor issued a proclamation offering a big reward, and a printer's apprentice came forward. So he was a wealthy merchant. He could have afforded easily to pay the bail, but refused to because he was a member of the Sons of Liberty, and he decided that they could make a real point out of political martyrdom. Mm-hmm. And he became, in a sense, the John Wilkes of America.
Yeah.
And the number 45 was adopted here, and all throughout New York, and then all throughout the colonies. The number 45 was used in every possible way. I mean, they would have dinners, for example, with 45 gentlemen who would eat from a cow that had been killed at 45 months, and it would be 45 pounds, and they have 45 toasts, and at the end of the meal, 45 women would come in, and they would do 45 minutes of dancing, and that kind of thing. But and the newspapers were just full of this.
Yeah, and Alexander McDougall was visited upon by 45 virgins in his jail cell.
Right. So the number 45 was a means to get public attention, and so having 45 so-called virgins visit him in a jail cell, made all the papers. This was all set up in advance. And in fact, Alexander McDougall was visited so often. Now, keep in mind, he's a prisoner in a dark, cold jail cell in New York during the winter. He had so many visitors, including these 45 virgins. They actually had to take an ad in one of the local papers asking that his friends set up appointments to see him.
I think it was between the hours of 3 and 6 p.m. or something like that.
Yeah, I think he needed the other hours to write his protests. And but this spread, it was an opportunity to spread through a symbol every bit as powerful as a liberty tree. But this time it was a number, 45.
And you mentioned that Alexander McDougall got in trouble for his criticism of the assembly in New York, his anonymous criticism. Can you talk about the role that anonymous speech played during the Revolutionary era? Because almost all of our founders who published during this time did so anonymously. If you look at the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, McDougall, John Dickinson wrote as The Farmer. Why did they do it that way? And bringing it to today, what is the conception of anonymous speech today and our relationship with it to the founding generation?
Sure. Well, they did it back in the colonial times for a number of reasons. One, of course, was to evade the seditious libel laws. So if they were writing, essays against the Stamp Act or any of the other acts of Parliament, they were worried that they might be prosecuted, so they would take on a pseudonym. They would also use it to give the sense that there were more people writing against whatever they were writing.
Mm-hmm. Because one individual would take multiple pseudonyms.
Yes. So Samuel Adams, I think, over this period had more than 20 pseudonyms. Uh-huh. And so people would take these different pseudonyms writing on the same issue. Mm-hmm. And it just looked like more, there were more people agreeing with them. Mm-hmm. Also, they took on names that gave a certain sense of who they were. They would take on, like a son of liberty, mm-hmm. right? Or, a friend of the Constitution or uh-huh. something like that. The name itself conveyed
information,
meaning.
Yeah. You talk about that in your chapter about John Dickinson. He was a learned man who took the name The Farmer to sort of endear himself to the average man, endear these arguments to the average man.
Yeah, so John Dickinson was a lawyer. He was educated in London in the law. And he was a far cry from a farmer in his daily activities. But the key thing was that at that time, the colonies were an agrarian society, and farmers were, and the land, working the land was revered. And John Dickinson took on the name of the farmer. And the way he described himself at the beginning of his first essay, The Letters of the Farmer from Pennsylvania, his first letter introduced himself as this farmer who had retired from the fields, and he had been successful, and he was in the library of his home reading various books and looking at what was going on, and very troubled by it. And he gave the sense of this, very smart, learned man of the land who was kind of far off from all the conflict that was taking place in the bigger cities, and he could look kind of dispassionately on what was going on and render some kind of judgment or understanding. And people read it, and they got the sense of who this person was through the pseudonym he took and through his self-description. And the name The Farmer just resonated all through the colonies. People toasted him all throughout the colonies. There was even a ship named after him, The Farmer.
You write in your book that his publications were amongst the most popular of the founding generation, but his star sunk a bit when he didn't vote in favor of independence.
That's right. He was in a sense carried the colonies towards independence through his writings, through his extensive understanding of English law and how he thought it applied to the Acts of Parliament. He was also the author of the Liberty Song, which became very popular. So he was both a pamphleteer and kind of a best-selling songwriter, and that shows kind of both sides. Somebody who is agile enough intellectually to engage people with the most complex legal arguments, and also understanding that wouldn't, reach everybody, because not everybody was able to understand that. So he authored the most popular song, which and set it to British military music that everybody knew. And so people immediately took it up all over the colonies. And so he sort of understood both sides of it. He had to popularize protest.
Yeah. Your book makes it clear in a number of places, however, that we shouldn't look at the founding generation through rose-colored glasses. One of your chapters deals extensively with John Adams's Alien and Sedition Act during his presidency. And you also talk about how in Virginia in 1776 they made it illegal to utter any word that defended the king or the parliament, or to persuade other citizens to return to a dependence upon the crown of Great Britain. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, these were the first instances of anti-speech laws being passed during times of national crisis. So there were laws in the colonies that were passed restricting speech during the Revolutionary War. But of course, the colonies were at war with the greatest military power on earth, and they had to have unity. That was the argument. And then later on in 1798, when the Federalists controlled Congress, passed the Sedition Act, you had great fear of war with France. France then was the greatest military power, and the young country, the United States, had virtually no military at all, and felt very much at risk of war. In fact, the French were already seizing American merchant ships, and so John Adams was ramping up the military to anticipating a possible war, and along the way they felt that they had to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, sort of the first really serious, actually the most odious in American history, probably, the anti-speech law. And the Alien Acts reflected the nativism of the time. Of course, that's carried through today. There's many episodes in American history of that. Then it was against French people, French citizens living in the United States, and any immigrants coming over. They just didn't trust them.
So you argue that the founders believed that, and you cite a lot of sources. You cite a lot of sources throughout this book, and that's one of the things I love about this book, is it's extensively footnoted, or endnoted, I should say. But you argue that the founders believed that freedom of speech and the freedom of press were essential to democracy. But there's a portion at the end of your book where the founders are debating, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, how to enumerate that, or whether to enumerate those rights with a Bill of Rights. The Federalists believed that if you created a Bill of Rights and enumerated certain rights, that would presume that the others weren't held by the people, the other rights that weren't listed didn't exist. The Anti-Federalists argued that you needed to enumerate these rights, otherwise the governing bodies wouldn't respect them. Do you ultimately think that the Anti-Federalists were right?
Well, another argument by the Federalists is that they created a government of enumerated powers, and the government simply had no power over religion, it had no power over the press, and so it simply couldn't legislate in those areas. And so, why did you need to say so? They lost that argument because ultimately, in a number of the ratifying conventions, the Federalists simply could not get approval of the Constitution without agreeing that they would consider amendments after the Constitution was ratified. And so Madison, in fact, went to the first Federal Congress and proposed a number of amendments, including the First Amendment.
Yeah, and Madison had all along argued that these sort of amendments would just be parchment barriers to any sort of tyranny. He thought if these beliefs and these rights didn't live in the hearts of the citizenry, that they would never exist, no matter what the Constitution said. But when he was writing that First Amendment, or writing the amendments, he initially, and this is something that I didn't know and I learned from your book, had proposed 2 amendments protecting expression, if I'm not mistaken. One prohibiting the federal government from infringing on freedom of speech in the press, and then a second amendment that sort of is like our 14th Amendment today and our incorporation doctrine, that prevented state governments from doing so. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, this amendment was ultimately was not approved by Congress, and so was never sent to the states for ratification. And Madison actually thought that this was the most important amendment that he had proposed.
These two amendments.
Yeah. Of course, what became the First Amendment was ratified, but the other one that would apply some of the portions of the Bill of Rights, including freedom of the press, to the states, didn't get past Congress because there was always this argument. It exists today in the United States and goes back to this period. The push and pull between the power of the states and the power of the federal government, and there were a lot of people in Congress who simply did not want the states to be tied by the federal Constitution. They wanted to be able to do what they wanted.
You, at the end of the book, sort of put Madison forth as the person that brings all of these disparate ideas about freedom of expression together. The idea that it should be, speech should be protected both symbolically, in the press, spoken word, and assembly. And you say that Madison writes a compelling essay that brings all the libertarian arguments for freedom of speech together. Why did he write that?
You start to see some of these arguments develop over the years, over a period of maybe 30 years in the before 1800. These arguments developed by a number of libertarian writers who are using pseudonyms typically. And Madison picked up on this and he enlarged it and he made it a really full argument for freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And the argument was that one type of system was fine for England, where sovereignty was in Parliament and the king could do no wrong. And Parliament was seen to be the guardian of the people's rights. But in this new country, the United States, we had a new system. Sovereignty was now in the people. And they controlled their fate. They elected people to represent them. It was a republic. And so in order to participate in self-governance, because of popular sovereignty, people had to be able to fully discuss and debate all the relevant topics of the day. They had to be able to feel that they were free to criticize people in office and people running for office, and without fear of punishment. And so what Madison did in a very powerful way was connect popular sovereignty and republican government to freedom of speech and freedom of the press, that they were tied together in a way that they supported one another. And so that was his major contribution. Self-governance required the freedom to debate and discuss public issues and public men without fear of punishment.
Yeah, in short, democracy required freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
Exactly.
I want to finally here bring this to modern day, because you say in your book that it took a very long time for the legal structure in the United States surrounding the First Amendment to catch up with the actual freedom that those who lived during the revolutionary debate enjoyed as part of their right to free expression. You said the Supreme Court did not regularly use the First Amendment to strike down state or federal laws punishing speech until well into the 20th century, when it began to strengthen safeguards on expression. Why is that?
Well, it wasn't until 1925 that the First Amendment was made applicable to the states through the 14th Amendment. So all through the 19th century, any state laws that would infringe on speech or press were only subject to the limitations of state constitutions.
Yeah, and that's almost 135 years since Madison first introduced that concept.
Right. So the 14th Amendment eventually was made it possible to apply the First Amendment protections for the press to make it a limitation on state action as well. That took place in 1925. But even then, the ideas about freedom of speech and freedom of the press were very rudimentary. And it took a while, another 50 years, almost 50 years to come around to a more modern, what we consider a more modern and expansive and protective stance in favor of speech and press.
Well, I know you're a busy man, Professor Solomon, but I end my show by always asking our guests two questions, and they can be applicable to your book, or they don't necessarily need to be. If you were to recommend to someone one piece of literature, it could be a book or it could be a pamphlet, to read about freedom of speech or freedom of the press, what would that be? And then do you have a free speech hero?
I would. I think Madison's report of 1800 to the Virginia House, defending freedom of speech and freedom of press in the face of the Sedition Act, is probably the greatest single American document on the freedom of political thought. That's where he tied up all these ideas of self-governance and democracy and the need to have liberty of thought to really support our form of government. And a hero, I think it's Madison, because he was the first to really, in the fullness of his intellectual thought, bring all these ideas together. And in the great case of New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964, the Supreme Court of the United States spent a good deal of their decision, their opinion, looking back at the Sedition Act controversy and quoting Madison from his report of 1800. So it lived on, became influential. It took 164 years to reach that pinnacle of kind of governing a Supreme Court opinion, but I think that's what happened.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it. Professor Solomon, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, and I encourage anyone out there to check out his book, Revolutionary Dissent, How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was NYU Professor Stephen Solomon. If you're interested in reading his book, Revolutionary Dissent, it's available at Amazon.com or anywhere else that fine books are sold. If you buy your book at Amazon, please consider doing so through Amazon's Smile program, which donates a portion of your purchase to the charity of your choice. You can do this by going to smile.amazon.com and selecting your charity of choice, and I hope you choose the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and then just proceeding through the website as normal. You can do this with any purchase you make at Amazon, and it doesn't just have to be Professor Solomon's book, although I hope you will add that to your cart as well. Again, smile.amazon.com. I also want to give a special shout out to a former guest on the show, Ron Collins. Revolutionary Dissent first came to my attention in one of Ron Collins' First Amendment news digests for concurringopinions.com. If you're a regular listener of this show and a regular follower of First Amendment news, I highly recommend checking out Ron's First Amendment news write-ups. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that nearly everything that happens in the world of the First Amendment is chronicled there on a weekly basis. What he does with those write-ups is truly remarkable, and you can find them, again, at concurringopinions.com. This podcast is hosted and produced by me, Nico Perino, and recorded and edited by Aaron Reese. To learn more about So To Speak, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk, or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/SoToSpeakPodcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider rating us and posting a review at iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. Until next time, thanks again for listening.